Good afternoon. Good afternoon, colleagues, friends. Welcome to this house and welcome to the third edition of Latin American Days. Although the Chancellor of Uruguay, Mario Lubetkin, who's been a friend of mine for many years, has corrected me and says it's more of a dialogue, a Latin American EU dialogue. So I'd like to start by thanking the President Irache for her support and all of the S&D group. I'd like to thank the FEMS family and the Socialist family for organising this event. And I'd also like to thank Mr. Lubetkin for being with us today. We had the opportunity of the President coming here, but unfortunately he couldn't make it. And so in his place, the Chancellor is here, and it's a real privilege to have him participate in this event. So this is the third edition of a dialogue which is becoming increasingly relevant and strategic for both sides of the Atlantic. Today we have the opportunity to invite the Joint Secretary General of the UN Director of the UNDP, Michelle. We also have Eva Granados, Secretary of State for International Cooperation, Barbel Kofler, Parliamentary State Secretary, the President of the Brazilian Development Bank, we have Martín Clavijo with us today as well, the Executive Director of the Agency for International Cooperation, Luis Landón, the Cecilia Nicolini, member of the Mercosur Parliament, and former Senator and Senator of the Republic of Mexico, Beatriz Paredes, as well as many other friends and colleagues of civil society, the European Parliament, and other social sectors. So I was saying before that this is a relevant space for the progressive family, because for progressives of both regions, it's not about establishing a nostalgic relationship. It's about a strategic relationship for the present and the future. And if it's always been clear to us, it's especially more relevant now at such a complicated juncture in our political life right now. There are significant stakeholders who are putting our interests at risk and are questioning the world rules and world order that we have struggled to build. So that strategic alliance between progressives in Latin America and the Caribbean and those in Europe is more relevant and more important than ever. We have resources, we have knowledge and complementary skills. And so what we need to do now is to respond very specifically at how to make better use of those common resources, shared resources. And in a few weeks, we'll have the opportunity to celebrate a EU-CELAC summit in Colombia, and we'll be answering some of those questions and establishing those shared goals for both regions. For the progressive family in Europe, for the Social Democrats, that summit is relevant, as the COP will be as well, and the election of the new, hopefully female, General Secretary of the UN, where the region will also play a very relevant role. So we have a lot of important dates on the international stage where the relationship between Europe and Latin America and the Caribbean will be extremely relevant if we can join forces and work in a coordinated way. We'll have the opportunity to deep dive into important topics like instruments for cooperation that are required in a world that requires a knowledge exchange of science, resources, and a focus on renewable energy, a focus on shared objectives, and how to find additional funding for those shared challenges that we face, or how we can work together in order to reform financial and multilateral institutions so that they can be more useful and effective in achieving our goals. And we'll be focusing on another shared element, which is security and democracy. In both regions today, we are facing a shared challenge, which is security from a broader perspective. We need more autonomy and the right instruments in order to ensure security. But at the same time, we have to understand that security means protecting our citizens and offering them certainty in a moment of change and increasing complexity. This also affects public rights and our capacity to respond to the ongoing crises that we face. We need to get ahead of those crises in a technology-based world. And so security, from a broad perspective, which sometimes calls into question democracy, is another one of those shared objectives that we will be discussing in detail. So thank you once again to all of those who have made this event possible, especially to the S&D Secretariat, as well as the colleagues from my office who have worked tirelessly to create this event, and to all of those who have come to take part in this event. We're happy to welcome you all. And now I'd like to give the floor to the chair of the group. I'm very grateful for her support.
Thank you very much, Leire. Distinguished Minister of Uruguay, dear friends, it's an immense honor to welcome you to this edition of the Latin America Days at the European Parliament, or perhaps the European Latin American Dialogue, as you suggested. I think that's very appropriate. I'm particularly moved to be welcoming you at a time when we celebrate the 40th anniversary of the return of democracy in Uruguay, which recalls that democracy is not inherited, it is won. Democracy must resist fear, but it can also flourish in the ruins of dictatorship. Over 4 decades, Uruguay has built one of the countries with the lowest levels of inequality in Latin America, with one of the most solid democracies in the world, with environmental, social, and civil rights foundations, which are an inspiration for all progressive governments who are advocating for progress and education. This is an example of civic courage, and it truly resonates with our approach. Spain and Portugal will be celebrating this year the 40th anniversary of our entry into the European community, which was the beginning of our democratic community. This decision was the result of a collective dream to turn freedom into well-being and to transform economic progress into social justice. And just as we saw in Uruguay, the progressive forces were the ones who were bold enough to translate ideas into tangible policies. And this is why, as we stand here today, gathered among progressive Latin Americans and Europeans from both sides of the Atlantic, we're celebrating more than a dream, the persistence of an idea, which is that democracy is not just a political system. It's a shared promise among generations. Dear friends, we know that we are experiencing difficult times in Gaza and in Ukraine. International law and human dignity have been trampled on by barbaric policies with Netanyahu and Russia. And in the face of these, we cannot remain silent, because in order to achieve peace, we cannot remain neutral. We have to advocate for the justice of people in Ukraine and in Palestine, to advocate for international law in the face of arrogant leaders. We have to believe in the power of law rather than the power of force. And this is a belief which emerges from our common history. To quote Antonio Nocinos, this gave rise to international public law. So when we apply double standards, we're going against the defense of human dignity and what lies at the foundation of our relationship. But this is not just something to be waged in war zones. It's something which is fought in terms of going against protectionism waged by Trump and going against social justice. And in the face of this, we have no other option. It's time to strike deals with Mexico and Mercosur and to make them reality. We will be able to start the biggest shared prosperity area in the world, which will cover hundreds of millions of people and generate employment and well-being, as well as sending a positive message to the world, which is that in the face of isolation and confrontation, we have chosen openness and cooperation. The European Union and Latin America can and must be a solid bridge between the global north and the global south. And this is why, in the run-up to the EU-CELAC summit in Santa Marta, we must move from statements to commitments. We must look at debt relief. We must also ensure that we strengthen ties between our nations. We must look at the funds allocated under Gateway for 2027 and ensure that they reach our populations, that they generate employment and a green transition, which is fair. These are not just technical aspects. These are moral decisions, because what we must understand is that what's at stake is cooperation, spelling equality. And talking about equality, the planet is reaching its boundaries. The past 10 years have been the hottest on record, and extreme weather affects the poorest in the Mediterranean and the Andes. In the face of negationism spurred by the far right, we must advocate for the Paris Agreement and state clearly that it's not an option, it's a duty. We have to maintain our commitment to achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. Latin America is only responsible for around 3% of historic emissions, and they should receive support to achieve goals without sacrificing their future. We have to look at the resources that Latin America has and demonstrate that it should be put to the service of the general interest and future generations. We do not want a system which benefits only a few, but rather something which fosters freedom. There will be no climate justice or digital transition without social justice. We're seeing successive crises which have deepened inequalities. 1 in 3 Latin Americans today live in poverty. And poverty also affects the European Union, where millions of people are living at risk of social exclusion, without access to decent housing, without the potential to live in a state of well-being. And this is why we have put forward policies to fight poverty. We're also expecting progressive tax policies in the EU based on fair taxation. This is the cornerstone of the welfare state. We must also never forget that migrations represent a shared history. Latin America was a safe harbor for many Europeans fleeing from wars and dictatorships. And today, the European Union must honor that memory by staying true to the same values of hospitality and solidarity. Let us show that migration is not an issue to be solved, but rather a human reality which must be supported by rights. These are also employment rights, women's rights, LGBTQI+ rights. At a time where the far right seeks to reverse decades of hard-fought victories, we must show that there is no equality without women's rights, gender equality, and social justice. As we celebrate the 3rd edition of this event, let us move forward to build a new reality for Latin America and the EU. This is no longer a rhetoric dream, but a political vision. a transatlantic community sharing language, history, and culture, but above all, values and destiny. It's a space where humanism, democracy, and social justice come together to resist authoritarianism. Today, when leaders such as Lula da Silva, Gabriel Boric, and Gustavo Petro are pushing for progressive policies in the region, we have an opportunity to come up with a strategy which is not nostalgic and backwards looking, but rather looking boldly towards the future. As Mario Benedetti said, when we thought we had all the solutions, all of a sudden the questions changed. And this is the task of our generation, responding to the new questions of the world with firm convictions based on progressive humanism. And I'd like to share a story. A man who was a guerrillero and a president, who knew hope and who knew prison, who stepped away from riches to live in humble settings. He said that lack of freedom was the main issue. He taught us that politics can only have meaning if they improve the lives of persons. And today I wish to pay tribute to José Pepe Mujica, because his life is a mirror in which we should see our reflection. He shared a humane and deep message, reminding us that there's no more noble cause than defending the dignity of human beings. And progressives on either side of the Atlantic should come together to do this with hope. Thank you.
Querido Mario, tienes la palabra.
Mario, you have the floor. Thank you. Lady, friends, colleagues, parliamentarians, representatives of European governments and of countries of Latin America, even representatives from the financial sector who are showing the power of progressives in the region, representatives of our UN agencies who represent multilateralism as well. On behalf of Latin America, representatives of civil society organizations and representatives of university. I'm not sure if there's anyone here from the world of academia or the private sector, because all of us together will only be able to change things if we collaborate. And I had prepared a speech, which I'm not going to read out, actually. And I don't want to be politically correct either. I don't want to address all the different topics. I want to just address 3 or 4 issues. Because for me and for others, and I don't just refer to Uruguay, I understand that the exchange of views and dialogue and finding the answers to so many questions that we have is one of the key exercises for us. And I think we spend a lot of time running around, but now it's time to sit down, listen to each other, and exchange views. And from what I saw from the program, this is going to be a great opportunity. Hopefully, these kinds of events can be organized more regularly. We, as you've said, have to mirror all of these issues. We're living at a time when technological developments are such that we could even broadcast this meeting to Latin America. That's something we have to work on in the future. It could be streamed. There's little sense in limiting an event to just Europe or Latin America. So I actually wanted to convey greetings from Yamamando Orsi, the president. He wanted to come here, and then he would then move on to the 80th anniversary of the FAO and then meet the Pope. But the first part of his agenda, his program, was cancelled, and so he sent me in his place. And it's not easy to fill the shoes of the president, but I wanted to talk about the fact that we live in a world that is becoming increasingly tense and fragmented. And so for that, we need new kinds of dialogue, cooperation, and trust. These are regions which culturally were and are similar. We have a shared history and values, which I think are extremely important. And in Latin America, we have waged our own battles. We have fought for peace and democracy, human rights, the rule of law, sustainable development in an environmental sense. So both regions are very closely intertwined when it comes to these topics. And so I'm representing one of 33 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I'm sure you're familiar with Uruguay. It has some characteristics which I hope live on. I don't know whether they will, but I hope they do. We will fight for them to live on. It's a very stable, incredible country, in fact, that is willing to support its region and the rest of the world as well, because it's our responsibility. It's not just the responsibility of people in Uruguay, Latin America, and Europe. It's a responsibility of everyone to de-escalate tensions in regions of conflict in the world. And that's because we've defined ourselves in Latin America in this way. It has to be a peaceful continent. And we will repeat this over and over again because I think it's one of the most important values that we have to protect. It's how we contribute to the international landscape. I talked about the environment briefly, and I think some of you are aware of Uruguay's environmental development. We have in the last decade, we've been working on responsible and sustainable agriculture, traceability of livestock, and we have been preserving our native forests. We have been issuing environmental bonds, sovereign bonds that are linked to the environment, and I think that is the trend that we will see in Latin America. Some are moving more quickly than others, but we are generally moving in that direction in the region. And in Europe, in terms of cooperation, we've really been focusing on education, security, sustainable development, and other aspects which have a lot to do with the Global Gateway and the general spirit of the initiative. The agreements that have been reached between the EU, Chile, and Mexico and Mercosur are significant. And I would ask my colleagues if I could perhaps speak to this very briefly, because I'm part of Mercosur and because we're at a point now where there are some aspects I wanted to highlight as part of our dialogue today. I think the EU-Mercosur agreement, if we look back on the history of Latin America and Europe and the EU, is the culmination of a very long history that we have together. Never has the EU or Mercosur signed an agreement like the one we have signed that includes 31 countries with a GDP of trillions, if I'm not mistaken, if we were to join it all together. And that covers around 750 million people. It means that we are starting a new phase in our relationship, in a new context, and we all understand where we stand right now in an international sense. We demand multilateralism, and so I think there are two ways we can confront this. We can either focus on the difficulties, on the problems and the fears associated with this agreement, or we can understand that it is the way forward for both regions. We, in Mercosur, would like to focus on that second path. We understand that there are fears and difficulties and that problems will emerge, but that the future is much stronger than any of those difficulties that we'll face. If we focus on that agreement, if we work hard and read that agreement and not just focus on what's said behind the scenes or what the media says. And that's because all of us who are here in this room are clear about the fact that none of us alone will be able to overcome this situation. None of us alone will be able to have that much influence on the new world that's being built. We need to establish partnerships, and one of the more natural partnerships that we can undertake is the one between the EU and Latin America, and in this case between the EU and Mercosur. And even though we might have our doubts about this, and there may be some difficulty in understanding the value of this partnership, life and experience has taught me that there have been other agreements that have started off in the same way. I think there was an agreement with Canada that people had doubts about, and the figures speak for themselves now. So I think we live in a fast changing world. We can't afford to stop right now, because there is one thing that is clear. We can't afford to stand still. And it seems like months have gone by, but we actually came into power on the 1st of March, and there are some thoughts and considerations that I wanted to share with you. First of all, when we had the meeting with the parliamentarians, MEPs came to see us, and there were 4 in favour and 4 against, representing the different parties. And we had a very open discussion. Then I think we went to Argentina and then to Brazil, and some of the ones who were against came into contact with a reality that they'd only seen on paper before. But there was something else that emerged. The EU-Mercosur agreement is not just a trade agreement. It is a project on how to develop a community in the next 20 years. And if we don't look at it that way, then we won't understand the direction in which the world is heading. Trade, the economy, all of those issues have some weight, the environment as well. But if we don't focus on the new international landscape, and if we don't establish this new community of 800 million people, then I don't think we would be doing things correctly, because we need to consider this relationship against the backdrop of so many global changes. And so these MEPs, even the ones that were against the agreement, invited us to visit their countries so that we could explain to them what we explained to them in Latin America. And that just demonstrates that sometimes our perceptions can differ when we're on the ground. We wanted to sign an agreement with the EU. We signed the EFTA agreement in Rio a month ago. And this wasn't a more complicated agreement than the EU one. EFTA includes Liechtenstein, Iceland, Sweden, etc. That was a very complicated setup. There were chapters of the agreement that came from the Mercosur agreement and that were made more specific. They were modified in order to mention laboratories, medicine, etc., and a number of different more specific elements. And life showed us that it was something that we could sign together, and it was put into action immediately, because in our respective countries we've already started working with the EFTA countries. So when the Vice President and the future President of Switzerland gave us a bottle of wine and cheese, it was indicative of how our relationship would continue. I think it just showed that we had to overcome certain challenges in order to move on to the next stage of our relationship. And so our citizens are calling on us to be more predictable, more credible, and more tangible. I don't think this is something they're just asking for in Latin America and Mercosur. I think European citizens are asking for this as well. I think they're becoming tired of how politics works nowadays. And so the results of these kinds of agreements are tangible and long-lasting. And this is part of the change that we have to face in the future. And in Mercosur, it will give us a different kind of strength. There are lots of different negotiations that are open at the moment. I talked about the EFTA deal that was closed recently, but with Vietnam, the UAE, and other countries, we may reach agreements in the future, but they will be completely different following the agreement we've reached with the EU. This is something that is within our reach. This is not something that will happen in the next 20 years. It will happen in the next few weeks and months. So that's why it's extremely important to reach an EU-Mercosur EU agreement before the end of the year. It's something we've discussed with the authorities, and we hope that Europe ratifies it as well, and that will drive us forward, because Mercosur will ratify this. Because if there's one thing we believe in our countries, is that we're ready. We are ready to sign this now. We say this to the governments, to parliaments, and there are contradictory views about this in civil society as well. But despite that, we want to sign. There are political and ideological views that have influence, because Paraguay and Argentina are quite different to Brazil and Uruguay, but we have reached an agreement on this deal. So I think it's possible to go even further than ideology and politics. I finally wanted to highlight, as I said at the beginning, that we, as I've said before, are ready to move forward in this process with Europe. We're trying to reach a consensus with Brazil and the other Latin American countries, and we will preside the CELAC event in April. So a lot of the issues that are discussed in Santa Marta, we will have to put in place and execute over the next year. We will then take over the presidency of Mercosur soon. And if everything goes as planned, the deal will be signed before the end of the year, and we will start to implement the conditions in that agreement during our presidency. But it's important that it gets signed under the Brazilian presidency, and that the work that the Brazilians and others have done can be finalized. But as you know, we cannot waste time. We've come to a crossroads, but obviously there will be difficulties. Different kinds of difficulties will emerge, but I think there is a great willingness on our part, at least, and we also feel that we have a lot of support from Europe as well, especially from this progressive family, because we understand that it's important for our Latin American citizens to have prospects and to have a future, and that they are on a par with European citizens. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Mario.
Thank you very much, Mario. Thank you, Irache. Let me remind you that this is being broadcast live on the S&D website, and we have interpretation into various languages for those that need it. And now I'd like to invite the first panelist to join me on the stage for the first discussion.
Dear friends, dear colleagues, Udo Bullmann, I'm having the privilege to moderate this first panel of this wonderful gathering, this wonderful meeting. First of all, I see the interest in the audience. I see this wonderful panel. I see the start off of our conversation. My congratulations to our group, to Lera Pagini especially for organizing the Latin American Days of the SND. My congrats to the whole family of Social Democrats that is involved in this wonderful exercise. And my big thank you to our panelists who are with us, with you together, wonderful audience. You will not regret being here. We are going to sell hot stuff this afternoon in this first gathering, in this first meeting. We are talking about Global Gateway, which is one of the flagship debates in the European Union in the external affairs at the very moment. Let me please, first of all, introduce our panelists. From the left, starting, there is Martin Clavillo, Executive Director of the Agencies of International Cooperation of Uruguay. Then we have Eva Granados, next to me, Secretary of State for International Cooperation in Spain. We have on the right-hand side, Michel Mouchet, Director UNDP Regional Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean. And we have with us Aloisio Mercadante, President of the Brazilian Development Bank. Welcome to all of you. Plus, we have somebody online, good friend of mine, Bärbel Kofler, Parliamentary State Secretary to the Federal Minister of Economic Cooperation and Development. I hope that the connection already is functioning. I got to hear she will be a bit late, but I trust our technicians that they will do the very best to organize everything so that we can include also this important voice from Berlin. Working together in this social democratic family means that we take the lead. Take the lead to face the challenges ahead of us. You know about the challenges very well, so there is no need to rediscuss them. You know them better than many others because you are active in the international politics world. You know about the climate change. You know about this immense polarization between poor and rich, the enormous amount of inequality between our countries within our societies that is poisoning the energy of our folks on their march to a better future. And you know all that kind of worries. We do not need new wars, new international military conflicts, putting people in the situation to flee their countries, producing more refugees than we have seen any other time all over the globe. This is a time that needs socialists, that needs social democrats, that need progressives. And the progressive family needs to collaborate to achieve better results for everybody all over the globe. And that was mentioned already in the opening remarks and by His Excellency the Minister right before in his speech. If we, the two continents from Europe, the friends and collaborators in Latin America cannot do the job, cannot do the trick to come together to solve problems, who should be able to doing that? So this is the spirit of best collaboration in which we start on this panel on this tricky issue, Global Gateway. And Global Gateway, you know that, is for 3 years long the new flagship idea of the European Parliament. to reach out to our partners all over the globe, to interact with partner countries in the world, and to bring in mutual interest in investments that we need from both sides, in infrastructure, digitalization, energy, mobilization of transport resources, but also education and health, of course. We need to have this basic fundament of well-being of our nations, otherwise we will not be successful in economic terms. But there is a lot to talk about. Well, you have a certain amount of money. We need a certain collaboration, of course, with private investors, that's for sure. But there is also the need to protect and defend the classical ODA schemes, humanitarian aid. So it has to be a holistic way forward. And in this European Parliament, we talk about the different lines that have to be taken. We struggle very often about the right way to doing that, because what is at the core of our intention as socialists and democrats, we want to have real mutual progress. What does it mean in practical terms? We know that the societies in Latin America need decent jobs, vocational training. The young generation has to have a chance to grow up and to intervene in the future successfully of their nation, of their society. So we need jobs. We need to build up small and medium-sized enterprises, because the job cannot be done only by the big fish, neither by the big fish here nor by the big fish there. We need to focus on the ground. Yes, and we need especially women. We need to include the gender debate, because in many, many societies also here, women are those who carry forward, not only in their families, but also in the economic life. And we have to ease the way forward for girls and for women in the economic dimension of their societies. So that is jobs, that is small and medium-sized enterprises, that is deepening the value added production in our partner countries, not going for the quick profits that others do. We want to have really partnerships on the ground, and we need to decisively fight inequality. This is in the genes of our social movements, and this is the obligation of the day. And we are very happy that the European Commission in the last mandate, on behalf of our group as well as on behalf of the initiative of former Commissioner Jutta Urpilainen, Social Democrat from Finland, included the so-called inequality marker, which indicates to what extent our partnerships really serve the interest of the lower 40% of the income scala in our partner countries. So this is close to our heart. But we know we cannot solve the practical problems and the steering of Global Gateway in the bubble of Brussels. We need to listen to you. We need to listen to the important players, of which we have some here in our panel debate. And Martin, if you allow me, coming from far away from Uruguay, to take the floor and to first of all inform us for 5 minutes, what is your concrete expectation for this new, whatever it is, Global Gateway project line? It's a process, a strategy, much more than only one single event. Could you give us your explanation, your expectation on that?
Bueno, buenas tardes.
Well, good afternoon. First and foremost, I would like to thank you for inviting me to share with you this dialogue among the EU and Latin America. And I'd also like to thank the colleagues from the Socialist Group of the European Parliament and the PES. I'm representing a government. Now, some of you may know me from another life. I've worked in several positions in my country, and now as part of the progressive government of Uruguay. And I am the Executive Director of the Agency for International Cooperation of Uruguay. And there are some issues that we work on together with the European Union, which is a strategic partner for our country in several areas of cooperation. And today we're talking about the Global Gateway. And I'll be sharing how it works, what its potential is, and whether we feel it's necessary to adjust or amend the program. So I'll start from the beginning. Of course, as a region in Latin America, there is a great deal of uncertainty. We're seeing the crisis of multilateralism with the influence of global players such as the US and China are decisive. And within this context, I believe that dialogue between Latin America and the European Union is an opportunity for cooperation, but also for political dialogue, to strengthen trade ties among our regions. Now, as you know, Global Gateway aims to raise 390 million euros in investment. This is an opportunity for our region, and in many cases, stagnation of production leads to stagnation in economic growth. So, as colleagues have mentioned, areas such as digitalization, clean energy, transport, health, education, and research are key when it comes to ensuring sustainable development. However, investments, of course, must have a direct positive impact on the quality of life of our people to ensure more cohesive, dignified societies. Investments cannot be an end in themselves, but rather a means to achieve these ends. If not, there's no point in raising investment if they simply improve national statistics rather than addressing structural inequalities within our countries. Now, Uruguay is a high-income country, yet there are structural divides which need to be addressed. And this is why we need to continue strengthening our cooperation. But we also are working on capacity development within our country and alongside other countries in our region. Sustainable development must be a driver in all of these projects, and the Inclusive Societies project is an example which is led with Spain, Germany, France, and Italy, and it aims to strengthen the social dimension of cooperation between the EU and Latin America and the Caribbean, with a particular focus on generating investments for the most vulnerable communities. And I'd like to mention this because we've just had the Sevilla conference on funding, and it highlighted a number of issues relating to social development. In Uruguay, we've started implementing this program focusing on social investments and decarbonization. We are implementing this program alongside national partners to ensure that there's not just sustainability at an environmental level, but also to ensure gender equality and employment, and to ensure that those most affected by climate change will benefit from these investments. We have a cross-cutting policy. All cooperation projects must have a gender perspective. This is the position of the national government. Now, in closing this first statement, clean energy, education, digital connectivity, health, and transport, all of these sustainable, must contribute to building better societies. But investment in these areas must go to the most vulnerable and ensure that no one is left behind, particularly the most vulnerable. This requires a holistic approach with investments and projects aimed at fostering social inclusion and gender equality in all the areas of the project. Thank you.
Gracias, Martin. With Martin, one of our partner countries has spoken, and he has indicated that it is not only wishful but also feasible to come forward with holistic programs of transformation, making use also of our partnership. But we know, guys, we cannot do it alone. It needs a multitude of positive actors. It needs a lot of collaboration, and not the least, it needs money. So I'm turning to the banker on the panel, Mr. Aloisio Mercadante, President of the Brazilian Development Bank. You are a decisive actor. The promotional banks, development banks, are decisive actors in the game, in Latin America as well as here. We need the collaboration of your institutions amongst themselves in the partner countries, the support. Insofar, we also have to listen. We like to listen to you. What is your first assessment? Is there a useful tool coming into existence? What is your first scrutiny? What is positive? What has to be improved? Please.
Yo voy a hablar en portugués.
I'll speak Portuguese, which is like Portuñol but badly spoken. So as interpretation is available, you can use the headsets if you have any difficulties understanding me. And so given that we are on the international stage, we're in an international event, and we are currently experiencing major political upheaval. And so I think this is an opportunity, actually, for us to discuss specific initiatives about how to combat that very tense situation that we find ourselves in. What needs to be at the heart of the EU's program and any partnership based on cooperation is the climate crisis. We need to make progress regarding the agenda on extreme weather events, which are becoming more intense and more frequent. We are experiencing fires, heat waves. In the case of Brazil, there have been unprecedented floods that have never been seen before in our history. 400 cities have ended up underwater. I don't know how long it will take certain countries to overcome certain extreme weather events. In Brazil, we've spent huge amounts of money trying to combat all of these issues. And so we need to start to discuss the existence of a sovereign fund, some kind of fund for climate emergencies and climate-related events. We also need to build up resilience to climate events, as is the case, or as has been the result of other partnerships like clean energy, for example. Banks have been funding different environmental and energy initiatives in order to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. And it's dropped significantly among the G7 countries. So we need a specific fund for emergencies, for fires, for flooding, for environmental disasters, which are going to become more and more intense and more common. The other issue that I wanted to address is regarding multilateralism and the fact that it's in crisis at the moment. we're seeing a lot of authoritarianism, unilateralism is being imposed. Brazil has a trade deficit with the US since 2009 of $401 billion. And then we saw how only last year the deficit was $19 billion. And then it increased by 10% and then 40%. So what is the argument? What the reasoning for this? Brazilian justice couldn't justify a coup d'etat who wanted to kill the president, the vice president, and the ministers. This is a citizen who wanted to drive a truck loaded with kerosene near an airport in Brazil. And the National Congress was one of the targets, as well as many other institutions. And there were many other initiatives that I'm not going to describe here, that they were documented and photographed. And Lula then said that democracy and sovereignty were not subject to negotiation. And so we went to a multilateral organization to discuss all of these issues and these differences of opinion regarding trade. We went to this organization, we put forward our position, and happily, despite a couple of antagonistic speeches, we started a dialogue because of that good relationship with Lula. And that led us to set up a roundtable discussion. 45% of tariffs were withdrawn, and now we're able to invest $8 billion in helping out those companies that were impacted by all of these issues. That helps us to keep jobs and open up opportunities in new markets. So that's one topic I wanted to address. We also need to make progress in trade relationships between Latin America and the EU. And I think that if we had jointly responded to those attacks, then we would have been stronger. If we try and negotiate in isolation, then everything becomes a lot more difficult to find a solution, which is why I criticized the Mercosur-EU agreement at the beginning. But we do actually need to sign that agreement in December, because the response to the crisis and to multilateralism is increased multilateralism, more partnerships, more cooperation, more mechanisms for negotiation that is integrated, that has compromise as one of its main mechanisms in order for us to be able to reach an agreement. The EU represents more than half of the investments and economic assets in Brazil. There is a huge amount of trade with Brazil. It's actually the second biggest trading partner of the EU. And so that agreement is incredibly important for us to open up opportunities, to develop more partnerships and see and experience more advantages for everyone involved in that agreement. And so that way we should be able to go beyond trade, because the EU is an example of civilization throughout the world. So we're looking for more partnerships with the EU, because that is how we will improve things for everyone. And I think that's what the world expects as well. And it's important for us. It's important for that to happen under the Brazilian presidency. It's important for us to sign that agreement between the EU and Mercosur. 720 million people will be represented. $22 trillion of GDP will be covered. So it's a huge agreement that will help to deepen the relationship between all of Latin America and the EU. The third topic that I wanted to raise is the big digital technology companies. We're witnessing a digital neo-colonial moment, and this will continue if we don't respond. I mean, we can't deny technological progress. These services are important for society, but it needs to be governed democratically. And I think the EP will have a major contribution to make. We need to really deepen that negotiation so that other countries in the region can develop protective mechanisms for those who are most vulnerable. Mechanisms that will help us fight against fake news and the manipulation of elections that the far right has been involved in recent elections. And we also need to cooperate when it comes to artificial intelligence. This is a disruptive technology, and it will have a more and more decisive role in the economy and in society at large. And so we can obviously produce artificial intelligence, and we need to be involved in that. Otherwise, we'll be kept outside of the algorithm and everything related to the building of a digital future. Supercomputers, artificial intelligence, we all need to work together on this. And we need to be involved in producing that information, not just using it as consumers. And we need sovereignty on our data and our data centers as well. So that's another very important contribution that the EU can help us with. How can we develop AI mechanisms? How can we develop them together? How can we protect our data centers? And I wanted to end by saying that maybe the most important initiative isn't related to the world of trade or technology. It's in our commitment to democracy and human rights and the values of civilization. Europe is a role model for us, and it's taking on a historic role in a very courageous way. And we're expected to do our part, but we need partnerships for this. And the relationship between the Global South and the European Union can change things. It can help us build on a new kind of multilateralism. Gandhi, Mandela, Mujica, Lula made history, and I think together we can start a new chapter of history in order to face up to unilateralism and authoritarianism, because we believe those values are very important.
Obrigado, President. Thanks for your frank words, frank speech, open-minded discourse. Thanks for your compliments to the European Union. But we can serve on that to Brasilia. The world has seen a president not shying away from confronting the other one in the White House. It was a bold position that was taken vis-à-vis the aggression that is permanently flying between the US and your country. Undeserved, totally undeserved, I have to say. And the world took note of a certain judge that was sanctioned by Donald and was not allowed to come to the US anymore. And I was in Brazil when the rumor was growing that he answered directly that he is not bothered about that and that he only would worry if he couldn't come to Paris again. So this shows a certain degree of like-mindedness between Europe and your country, and this shows democratic freedom and self-esteem. This is exactly what the world needs, and I would say the people of this globe, the progressive family, is looking at you full of admiration and full of applause about the role that you are taking in the current international debate. Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that. We turn now to Eva Granados, Secretary of State of International Cooperation in Spain. You are speaking for a government that is spearheading on international collaboration and that always advocated international cooperation and is striving forward also in the council debate that we have to deliver. What is your expectation on Global Gateway and what would you like to see on further developments?
Muchísimas.
Thank you very much, Uda. And thanks to the S&D group for inviting me to take part in this event and these Latin America EU Dialogue Days. I'm delighted to be here, and having listened to inspiring remarks from a small and a bigger country, I'll try to contribute to the discussion. You asked us to stick to 5 minutes, so I'll try and summarize, and maybe I'll be able to come back to some aspects later. Having listened to Irache and the Foreign Affairs Minister of Uruguay, I was thinking that today we are each gathered here with our own sense of responsibility as progressives from Latin America and the EU. And we have a great responsibility indeed ahead of us, given the state of the world. All of us here today, I'm sure, are very convinced of this, and I'm sure that we share a great deal of elements in common, but I'd like to thank the organizers of this event for bringing us together. I think it's very necessary for us to have the opportunity to meet and to consolidate the proposals we have as progressives, because I believe that defending democracy is the most important. We'll be talking about democracy and investments, which are related to Global Gateway and which is currently being negotiated as part of the European Union's multi-annual financial framework. But democracy and sustainable development are two key ideas. And within both of our regions, I believe our political families share ideas, but also the same fate. And that's something which brings us all together today. I'll present some ideas for this first panel. And I'd like to begin by coming back to what was said by the director of the Brazilian Development Bank. Currently, we're seeing impunity, tariff wars, calling into question of international law. And in the face of this, how do progressive leaders in government and in parliament respond? How can we come up with some way of defending democracy, which is a pillar of our societies? How do we ensure competition? How do we ensure that we defend societies in the face of individualism? These are all questions which I believe we could answer in one sentence, and that is we have to share a social contract. We have to redistribute wealth. We have to share the benefits with people around the world. So at times like these, when uncertainty is rife, I believe it's important to have a sense of direction. This roadmap, the 2030 Agenda, has been in place for 10 years now, and there are 5 years left to reach our goals. But I believe that it represents a shift in the dynamic between donors and beneficiaries, the global north and the global south, and hopefully it will bring about a shift in our societies. We're seeing a triple transition, which the EU mentions in most of its strategic documents, in relation to Latin America, so social, digital, and environmental transitions. These are principles that guide us. Third idea. This framework, the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, are important, but we also have to ensure policy dialogue through negotiation and through agreements and national strategies for development. So it's not a vertical approach, it's a horizontal approach. And in Spain, we're identifying needs and coming up with national policies, and I'm sure that the UNDP will have much to say on this. Now, the fourth idea I wanted to share with you. The crisis of development is a crisis of underfunding. And recently, the fourth conference on financing for development in Seville issued a roadmap, and we noted that with ODA, we are not able to reach much if we are simply relying on the percentage of GDP contributed as ODA. We will not be able to achieve our goals. So when we talk about Global Gateway and when we talk about investment in partner countries, we have to talk about national resources too. We have to look at tax systems. How do we redistribute wealth within our countries? We have to look at international tax cooperation, controlling illicit financial flows, debt, and private investment. And against this backdrop, when we talk about development, Global Gateway, funding development, and the instruments we use, I believe it encompasses all of those aspects. And this is something which Martin mentioned. Reducing inequality must go hand in hand with increasing productivity. And we as progressives understand it this way. The most equal societies are the most productive societies. And investing in our social development programs, reducing inequalities, leads to increases in private investment. And that's how we see the Global Europe, Global Gateway, and other related programs. It's about sustainable investment, technological transfer, and sharing values. So, of course, it's not just about funding needs, it's about how we go about increasing funding. So, in our view, when it comes to Global Gateway, it's the how rather than the what that's important. And I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva. You reminded us very well on the overall framework of our issue, as well as on the preconditions: financial resources, redistribution, fight against inequality. It's now my pleasure to welcome Bärbel Kofler in Berlin. Hi, Bärbel. I can already see you. I hope you see us as well, and you can also listen to us. I will give you the floor now for 5 minutes. Bärbel is not only the Parliamentary State Secretary in the Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. She was that already in the last mandate. And what I can personally tell you, because we know each other, a true European, a true internationalist, a fighter in the first row. And Bärbel managed to stay in the lead in this important dossier also for our current government. There's a lot of things to talk about, Bärbel. What is your take on the overall situation and the necessities on Global Gateway?
Well, first of all, greetings from Berlin to everybody in Brussels, to everybody who is joining this important meeting. Greetings to you, Udo. Thank you for having me, for having the chance to discuss with you our relationships, our European relationships with Latin America. I think that's of utmost importance also for us in the German government, because I have the same challenge like some ministers or state secretaries speaking before me. I have two hats. I'm a social democrat and I'm speaking in behalf of my ministry. So for us at the Ministry of Economic Cooperation Development, it is really of utmost importance to have relationships with the Latin American continent. And we do that for almost 60 years. We are working together in many fields, and it really is very clear why we do that. We do that for very good reasons. We know that Latin America is the largest essentially democratic region in the world. We know that we have a lot of interests together, shared values together. If it's coming, for example, to human rights, like a lot of the previous speakers were pointing out, or to gender equality. And we see, of course, also a region of the world which has numerous middle-income countries where, at the end of the day, you can fight poverty in a positive way. So we see a lot of positive momentums to collaborate and to work together. And I think we have to explain that this collaboration is really working, because it was also mentioned by previous speakers that we are really having or facing a backlash in the conversation how international cooperation should look like. I couldn't agree more with one phrase I heard from the president of the Brazilian bank, who was saying we need more multilateralism to fight that backlash, and I would agree on that. We need more cooperation, but we have to explain how important and how successful it is. And for that, just for quoting one figure that UNDP is offering, I think it's impressive. The poverty rate on the Latin American continent has fallen from 45% to 25% within the last 15 years. So I think that's a good ground for work on, and a reason for work on, and also something which is important then for our conversation with Global Gateway. But there's always one but. And the but has already been mentioned. The but is the inequality, the SDG 10. And I think we have to have a close look together in our cooperation, how we really can overcome this topic of inequality. The UN Economic Commission is calling that already for Latin America and the Caribbean a development trap. So I think we should pay more attention to issues on inequality. And that's one of the topics we want to address also with our cooperation from Germany, really being structural partner on overcoming inequality. My colleague from Spain was pointing out very important points to that. For example, fighting illicit flows, really coming to lasting and sustainable structures in the financial sector, but also in the social sector. Climate change, overcoming the division of climate change was mentioned already. Those topics are very important for us. And if I narrow now the debate on a Global Gateway, I think we have to take those topics into consideration. I totally understand, and I'm agreeing that we need private sector, we need investment, we need cooperation on a public and on an economically private base. But that is not the only thing we have to do. It was mentioned there has to be value-added investment on the ground which creates decent, and I'm underlining decent, jobs to people in our partner countries. We have to have inclusion by women, by indigenous population, by the youth. We have to have all those things together to really see long-lasting, and I would say in a progressive social democratic manner, investment in our partner countries, in our cooperation. And what I want to underline, if we talk about Global Gateway, it is really that we have to include that in our programs. And it's honestly a little bit of fear of mine at the moment, because I see and hear a lot of tendencies who are talking only about investment in a mere economical sense, excluding the other things we have to do to work together on an environment which makes everybody in society benefiting from those investments. So the issue of inequality has to be addressed if it comes to Global Gateway. I think we could do a lot together as Europeans with our Team Europe initiatives. There are good programmings and good ideas on that way. but it's not good enough to discuss if we talk about development policy on a mere return of investment discussion, which I read from European DG IMPA. So I think we have to really have a close social democratic look on those settings to Global Gateway, which in the core, the investment, I'm totally agreeing, is very necessary. And by the way, just maybe my last sentence, because I see time's running very quickly, 5 minutes are over very quickly. I think we have also, as Europeans, keep our standards. It was mentioned already that standards are important: social standards, ecological standards, human rights standards, workers' standards, standards in closing the gap in between men and women. There are so many things we really could be proud of, and it should be included in our cooperation. And with having that said that, I hope there will be a debate in that direction also ongoing on a lot of regulations upcoming in the European Parliament, because the news I heard about Omnibus, my last sentence, is not really in going in that direction. So I hope you come to better conclusions in the European Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you, Bärbel, for, as always, this straightforward statement of yours. And let me say, because I see a lot of colleagues from the European Parliament, from the External Action, different committees here, especially from our Development Committee, what you say and what beforehand was said by Eva is laying the ground for our further fights, because this is exactly the line we are struggling for. So, and we appreciate the boost and the support from our member states that are in good hands, as we can see. Thank you for that. Now, we have already heard more multilateralism. That is a marvelous bridge to turn to Michel Muscat, being the director of the Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean in the UNDP. The United Nations and the agencies of the United Nations are best allies to our political family in the European Parliament, and this is what we are working on each and every day. Nonetheless, I know that there are a lot of worries in the United Nations family, not only about the guys in Washington, but also about other friends, that they should stick to the multilateral agenda, that they should stick to our joint demands for human rights, decent job creation, and fights against inequality, SDG 10 was mentioned. Please, you have been listening to the stakeholders from our partner countries, to European voices from our governments. Tell us what your take is. What do you feel? What do you think? What is your spontaneous reaction to the agenda on the table?
Gracias, Udo.
Thank you, Udo, and thank you for this privilege that I've had being able to listen to all the panelists. I'd like to convey all my appreciation to them, because we all work together as colleagues and as friends at the UNPD, focusing on sustainable development of the region. I'd like to welcome all of those who support us in this room. Lady, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for allowing the UNDP to be part of this conversation. It's been made very clear in previous speeches that this is a conversation about democracy, it's about development, it's about multilateralism, and when we bring these three things together, it's really a conversation about hope, and hope for a better future, more specifically, and how that can come to pass if we work together. And the UNDP and the EU have worked closely together for many years, and we collaborate in the implementation of Global Gateway projects in those areas which people have mentioned already, especially Martin, in those very specific areas in the region. However, there's a lot more that we could do. There are many other tools we could take advantage of The UNDP could be present in regions. We cover 42 different countries and territories, and this goes beyond political trends, governments, ideologies. We are there focusing on sustained development, and we also have a mandate, as Udo referred to. In regard to your question, it's worth reminding you of our mandate, which is to bring an end to poverty and to focus on sustainable, humane development in harmony with the limits of the planet. And we also want to strengthen democratic governance. And this is something that can only be done in Latin America and the Caribbean if we compare it to other developing countries, and democracy is crucial in all of that. It's the key link in the relationship between Europe and Latin America. And so at UNDP, when we talk about the Global Gateway, we talk about enabling conditions. It's something that affects the countries on a day-to-day basis. But I wanted to focus on how the Global Gateway can help us reduce poverty and inequality in the region. And so I wanted to give a perspective, a grassroots perspective of what's happening right now with regard to development in Latin America and the Caribbean. Barbara already mentioned a number of points that I'm going to develop in more detail. But first of all, we should take into account that Latin America and the Caribbean is a region with many contrasts. It has a great deal of biodiversity, the most in the planet, in fact, and that can provide opportunities in terms of sustainable development. It also has a lot of clean energy, which is important for the energy transition, and it has critical minerals as well, which is key for the energy and the digital transition as well. It's also the most democratic developing region on the planet. It has a strong democratic history, even though its democracy may not be perfect, and it faces a number of challenges. It's also the region with the greatest inequality. There's a lot of violence, even though there aren't any armed conflicts right now. And it's a region where political polarization has increased the most in the last 2 decades. So all of these phenomena and this backdrop, which has already been mentioned by the panelists, make this a complicated situation, and we have to confront this. We know that different areas can be affected in different ways by climate issues. As a colleague from Brazil said, there are also a number of health and other crises and policies that we've seen during COVID. So at the UNPD, we need to ask ourselves, how can we take advantage of the unique potential that exists in the region in order to drive sustainable development, not only in Latin America and the Caribbean, knowing that in the past it's been a pioneer in innovation, in social policy, and in defining a future. Brazil, for example, is one country that is at the forefront of innovation right now. I think to answer that question, the first thing we need to do, as Barbara has said very clearly, is we need to recognize that the region has made a great deal of progress in the last 3 decades. Not only has poverty been halved, life expectancy has increased by 7 years, and all of that has happened at the same time as democracy has been consolidated. So those achievements, those social achievements in Latin America and the Caribbean have happened during a democratic period and thanks to multilateralism. Today, this is a middle-income region, but it doesn't have a consolidated middle class, and that is part of the challenge that we face as a region. Today, 1/4 of the population in Latin America live in poverty, and we're talking about multi-dimensional poverty or monetary policy, but 1/3 of the population live not only in poverty but also in a vulnerable state. So any kind of disaster, any kind of problem affecting this group would mean that they would once again fall below the poverty line. So when we talk about how Global Gateway can reduce poverty and inequality, we need to see this within the unique context of Latin America and understand that vulnerability as well. If we're able to strengthen that vulnerable segment of the population, then we would be able to consolidate the middle classes as well. And that would enable us to overcome one of the major frustrations that is translating into a pressure on democracy in the region, because that progress that we experienced has led to higher expectations for the population, and solutions that worked in the past now don't work anymore. So we find ourselves facing a challenge that's quite significant, but there is a solution. First, we need to recognize that we can't continue with the same solutions to different problems. And the development strategy in Latin America and the Caribbean needs to put resilience at the heart of the development agenda. If resilience is at the heart of it, then development comes together with the humanitarian aspect. We develop resilience, and not resilience in terms of climate resilience, where the Caribbean is well ahead of us in terms of understanding resilience in general, but I mean in terms of human development. Resilience as something that helps us to protect individual freedoms, and resilience as a roadmap in order to make progress in development. And that is the main conclusion of our most recent regional report on human development, which I invite you to read, because with my background as a policymaker, it's not a report that has a conceptual framework that we could discuss in great detail. It also has a number of very specific tools as well. And so now I'd like to give the floor back to you, Udo, because it will help us to achieve this vision and finance or fund an agenda based on sustainable human development. It was also supported by the Spanish government. Thank you for your support over the last 15 years in these kinds of exercises, because it has helped us in a paradigm shift on a number of occasions. It has first helped us to include human development as part of the concept. So this approach can help us to change the paradigm of development. And in that report, we see how resilience is at the heart of the development agenda. It's not just a proposal from the UNDP, it's a mandate for the member states, because that report has informed our regional program, which has been approved by all the members of the UN in August. And it comes with a number of tools, which unfortunately I won't have time to describe in detail, but they are available to Global Gateway, and they will strengthen the relationship between the EU and Latin America. And I wanted to focus on one in particular, which includes all the different points, including the fund that our Brazilian colleague mentioned, and it also covers financing frameworks for development, and it's a finance facility for resilient human development, and it was presented at the Seville conference. It's a multi-stakeholder platform which includes multilateral banks, development banks who are already taking part, the private sector, multilateral cooperation, and the Global Gateway projects. They come together in order to generate synergies and take advantage of domestic capital in order to finance the agenda, which is focused on 3 transformational pillars. We have the instruments of public policy, for example. Poverty reduction instruments can't have the only aim of eradicating poverty. They have to include vulnerability and the potential to adapt to different places and kinds of people so that they're able to overcome the effects of any kind of shock or disaster. And so as a region, having had that experience with COVID, we understand that resilience is key to everything. We have infrastructure, digital infrastructure that can close gaps, and physical infrastructure that will shorten those physical distances. and also infrastructure which is resistant to the climate, because resilience, apart from what we've said already, can't just be a consequence of development, it has to be a key objective of this. And as an institution, we will support, thanks to the trust of governments, the region, but our aim is to strengthen democratic institutions and their ability to achieve results, not only through development, but in order to protect democracy in general. And I'll stop here, Udo, because I think we're all keen to have a second round of questions and comments, but I think we have a roadmap which has been validated by member states, and we are now willing to make progress in our cooperation for development, democracy, and multilateralism between the EU, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Thank you.
Gracias, and many thanks to you, Michelle, to have the compass set out rightly. You were talking about the resilience of human development, and we couldn't agree more. So let me quickly, and that is also on the way in which we proceed here, let me quickly tell you what I see here on the podium, on the panel, is a huge degree of unity, which I would simply sum up when it comes on the project lines of Global Gateway. Yes, do it, but do it in a way, Eva was saying not only the what, but the how, do it in a way that serves the people. And by serving the people in our partner countries, you are strengthening the social basis. And by strengthening the social basis, you are strengthening the economy of the respective partner countries. And by doing the two things rightly, straightforward, you're also adding on political stability, on freedom and democracy. This is my first lesson from the first round. But talking about the how puts us back on also very much questions which I would like to call engineering questions. How to do it properly, how to get it right, how not only to have these wonderful headlines, but being unable to implement what we originally wanted to do. So allow me to come back with a very sharp question with the idea of a very quick answer to our panelists before I open then for some 20 minutes also to the debate here. To the president of the Brazilian Development Bank, because you guys are important if we would like to be successful. And people like you who have this broad brain, have this broad picture of the development of a society are of the essence if we would like to get where we want to get. What do you need in terms of technical tools? If you look at this Global Gateway animal, is it already on track? Do we improve this or that, or what is missing perhaps, so that we can take it on board on our further deliberations here in the House? 1 minute would be fine, 1.5 is not bad, 2 is too much. Please come in.
Vou tentar.
Well, I'll try and be brief. When it comes to tools, I think the main one for Global Gateway is to deepen the relationship with public banks. There are 454 public banks that manage 23 trillion in actives and 11% in investments. My bank is 73 years old, and it's the biggest development bank in the Americas. It's huge, and it did a couple of. It was researched by the Court of Auditors, and it's one of the most transparent banks in the world. And I think that's also one of the main attributes of the Global Gateway, its transparency. So it achieved some of the best results we've ever seen. And it's a bank that finances the Brazilian economy to a great extent, and it has the greenest balance of the financial system. It is deeply committed to sustainability. So this is something I'd also like to highlight. The way we can perhaps develop this further is through the COP30. We are going to implement the Paris Agreement commitments and face up to climate change denial. I think there are very cheap and efficient ways of decarbonizing the planet. Planting trees is one of them. We are going to plant 73 million trees and dedicating around 800 million to the planting of trees. The idea is to restore the Amazon rainforest and preserve our biodiversity. We've reduced deforestation by 47%, and that has led to a reduction in emissions. So we're able to capture carbon by repopulating the forest and by putting an end to logging. It's a very simple and effective way of having an impact. The EU helps a lot with the Amazon rainforest. It's been a huge success, the Amazon Fund. The Climate Fund, I think, is also very important and can also help us in our development. The Climate Fund funds lots of different policies relating to industry decarbonisation, agriculture, and sustainability programs relating to the Brazilian economy. They're very, very efficient initiatives, and I think the idea now is to pass the baton on to the COP30 and talk about resources, because in COP15 100 billion was promised and that never arrived. And people are still asking, when is that coming? How is it going to work? Finally, if we want to protect the planet for future generations, it's important for the progressive family to wave the flag of peace, because the arms race that we're currently involved in, last year 2.7 billion was invested in defense, and the investment in weaponry is increasing, and that diverts funds from social inclusion, from protecting the environment. And so in order to face up to the climate change and increase gender equality, we need to focus on what's important. Brazil is going through an important time in its history with the lowest rates of unemployment, with the highest rate of job creation. We've established a decent minimum wage, and I think we will continue to make progress in human rights. So now, social inclusion and environmental sustainability is crucial. And I think as progressives, we need to see what is being done correctly by governments, implement positive measures, because we want to steer away from any irresponsible dialogue and conversations. Thank you.
President, for this wonderful statement and the exciting 2 minutes. Let me not be impolite, but I have to tell you we need to speed up. In this wonderful environment, we still have a totally authoritarian organizing system with straitjackets also for the moderator. And 5 minutes ago, I was told I only have 15 minutes. So since I'm totally anti-authoritarian, I tell you we have 17 and a half. But we skipped the coffee break. Everybody helps herself and himself with coffee here. And please, 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 one maximum of 2 minutes. I go directly with the same kind of question to Martin. Martin, what is in your way for your next success in your country? What do you need from Global Gateway?
Bueno,
Well, I'll try to stick to the allocated time, but please don't get angry if I don't. I've listened carefully to all of the statements, and I believe that there are lots of areas in which we agree in terms of how to proceed. Now, in terms of how we get there, Global Gateway does need a more territorial and more participatory approach. It shouldn't just be an investment-based approach focused on expected outcomes. We need to ensure that these initiatives actually bring benefit to local population. So we need a territorial approach to cooperation. Sometimes we forget why we are cooperating. The aim is to improve the living standards of people. So the investment programs of Global Gateway shouldn't just translate into infrastructure or outcome-based investment. When it comes to investment, as has been said, I believe we need to work in a coordinated manner with partnerships, working with the development banks, but also with the private sector and civil society. And we need to find common ground, and of course with governments too. We need to ensure that when it comes to the deficit that Eva was mentioning at the beginning, we're able to actually address these issues. And we won't be able to address the cooperation deficit we have if we don't come up with new instruments. And we mustn't be scared of speaking with the private sector, because sometimes there's a bit of reticence. Of course, if we want to attract private investment, we have to generate incentives. And the private sector may be able to provide these instruments I mentioned. In Uruguay, we have a number of instruments for sustainable investment in the areas of climate change, renewable energy, which have been successful to some extent, although there have been some obstacles, and they are the result of multi-stakeholder approaches. And I think we need to work within that framework. We need to have a horizontal approach. And here, for example, the agreement between Spain and Uruguay, which are two high-income countries, is an example of this. And this is something which could be discussed in other countries to go over and beyond difficulties in accessing financing. We need to ensure that there's political will. So we need to come up with cooperation initiatives. But if you were to ask me what should be improved upon in the Global Gateway, I would say the participatory approach, the territorial approach, and political willingness moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. There are concrete requests, and both of you, Eva and Bärbel, were very outspoken on your personal take and the political take of your roles in your governments. Let me say from the perspective, and this is the only promise that I have to break today, I will not be able to open the floor, unfortunately, so let me echo what I read from the mindset of my colleagues. We are working as tough as we can in the European Parliament to get it right, the Global Gateway thing. We are going straight forward. We are using all our muscles, but we need the collaboration in this ongoing process, the collaboration with the Council, especially, of course, with our member states, where we have a say. Otherwise, we will not be able to adhere to the compass that we all agree on. So would you like, Eva, to add an idea on that, and then I go to Bärbel, because what we used to have is years and years ago, when we were still stronger in the member states, a very effective collaboration on progressive level, on development and foreign affairs. How can we gain our collective strength so that our social democratic, our socialist position can fulfill the agenda and be helpful for our partners in Latin America? Eva.
Wow. Tenemos 2 minutos.
So I only have a couple of minutes. I'll be very brief. We're negotiating the new MFF, and we have Global Europe on the table as well. Governments will have to demand clarity, and in that negotiation, we need a 360-degree focus, because that also links up to what Clavijo said and the president of the Brazilian bank said as well. The Commission needs to coordinate with the member states, and that there has to be coordination at the grassroots level with our partner countries as well. We've talked about this logical framework, but now this needs to be put into action. You also talked about participation. If we coordinate member states on the ground with the delegations and with the authorities and development agents in our partner countries, and we also include CSOs in the dialogue, then I think we're doing our job well. We also need to create a global gateway that contributes to sustainable development, as we said, but also to local capacity, local skills. I think that's a contribution that we can make at EU level as member states. And I don't want to go on for too long because of the time restraints, but this hasn't come up this afternoon, but we have talked about shared values. Recently it was Girls' Day. UNICEF has already stated that many women here have been in positions of power, but there are lots of girls who are being born today and who will take 97 years to reach the stage that we've reached here today. So the European Commission, the Parliament, the agencies all have an important role to ensure that feminism makes more progress, and that is also one of the main goals of the Global Gateway.
Gracias. Gracias, Eva, and thanks to Bärbel, who is still with us in Berlin. You have the floor.
Well, thank you very much for your question. What could we do? You were talking about an environment, political environment, which was changing in the last years. And yes, in most of our member states, we don't have majorities anymore. We're not in government. And I totally understand that there is also a really strong majority in the European Parliament who is not on the progressive side. I'm really believing that we have to be more outspoken when it's coming to our values, clear in communication, so voters already also understand what makes the difference. I think sometimes in my constituency I get that feeling that people lost that trust that there is a difference in political decision making possible. So we have to be outspoken if it comes to our values. I think that is very important for me. And we have to explain better what we already achieved with the things we've done. If it's coming to a conversation we had before on our Latin American-European relationships and Global Gateway, yes, there are success stories to tell. And why are we not telling those success stories and trying to explain better how the life in other parts of the world is interlinked concretely with the life of the people we are interacting every day if we are home in our constituencies. For me, that's the most important thing. We have to work on the narrative because politic decisions are following the narrative. The majorities are following a widespread narrative. And I think we have to stand tall as social democrats, not to get into that trap to repeat in one or other place a right-wing narrative simply because at the moment there's a majority in the social network for things like that. We have to stick to our values and communicate them very clear. And in that sense, thank you very much for that discussion you are having today.
Thanks, both of you. I may say, our colleagues from governments and parliaments, the good news is again and again we can rely on you and we are on the same page. Thank you for commitments. Last word to the United Nations, to whom else than to you, Michel. I was impressed by, we had this big exercise of the Commission the other day, Global Gateway Forum. I was totally impressed by the words of Amina Mohammed saying to the audience, she was a bit too polite to be that blunt, but what she was saying was indeed, you Europeans, you need an attitude adjustment, because the Global South is not waiting for you to be saved. This is a misunderstanding of the situation. The Global South is in the very progress to create its own narrative on the state of the world and on the way forward. That gives you some food for thought. The right wing anyhow, but they do not listen, but the progressives as well. So we have to understand ourselves as well. If you look from the United Nations perspective on what we are doing, what lesson do we have to learn? What can we do to unite and to strengthen the progressive movement all over to achieve the 2030 and beyond?
That's an easy question, Udo. You left the easiest for the end. Complementando
Well, to add to what the Deputy Secretary General said, that is true. The EU is a key society for Latin America and the Caribbean, but it's not the only strategic partner for the region, and I believe it's important to bear that in mind. Now, through the Global Gateway, and above and beyond what we've discussed here, we need to look at the what and the how, both of them. For example, digital payments in Colombia, Ecuador Green as an initiative for the fair ecological transition. In Paraguay, we have electromobility and a tourism project in the Caribbean. There are other projects on elections, the participation of women in Honduras. These are all examples. Now, in order to come up with a conclusion here, I would say that we need to make better advantage of platforms such as the UNDP. We need to draw on expertise through the Global Gateway, not just to support our country offices, but as an actual platform to support development in the region so that we can bring these solutions to the ground. And we also, as Martin said, need to involve communities more. We need to understand how they feel about challenges on the ground. And we can serve as a natural bridge between the EU and the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean with which we work. And now, wrapping up, because I know about the time constraints, I deeply believe that the future of development and democracy is at stake today in Latin America and the Caribbean. And when we talk about development, our partnership with the EU is of particular interest, but it's something that cannot be consolidated on its own. Despite the challenges we face, we can move forward with hope. In the past, our region has been able to lead in these matters. And so resilience needs to be at the heart of our action. We need to be ready to move on to the next chapter of development. And if we work together, I still believe there's time to achieve this, to ensure that in the face of these challenges, we can address the major pressures on democracy and multilateralism. So we need to transform that pressure into a positive force in order to achieve a better development in the future in our region.
Thank you all. Thanks to Berlin, Bärbel. Thanks to the wonderful panelists here on our podium. My apologies to our excellent audience that we were not able, through to the authoritarian structure of this organization, to give you the floor. But it was worthwhile listening to the colleagues here. I'm joking. You know that time restrictions, time restraints happen once we are late in the program. I now hand over to my good friend Javi Lopez, Vice President, who will chair the second panel. And you are invited to have a flying coffee or something else. Then don't take a huge break because we are going to continue. Thank you very much.
Pues si os parece, vamos a empezar esta...
Okay, so I think we should start this next round, this next panel of Latin America Day, this dialogue between the EU and Latin America, which, as you well know, we celebrate every couple of years. S&D organised this event. It's the third edition, and I think it is proof of the commitment that S&D have when it comes to strengthening strategic ties between the EU and Latin America and the Caribbean. And we also have a deep-rooted belief that the progressives and the left in Latin America have more in common with us and more shared struggles with us than anyone else in the world of socialists and democrats. That is my deeply held belief. And so we have a great panel with us here today who have come to talk about defending democracy, solidarity and progress when confronted with authoritarian power, unilateralism, and some of the challenges we see in the international landscape. We'll talk about policies and cooperation, sustainability, and how to strengthen our strategic autonomy in a world in which dependence highlights our vulnerabilities in a political sense, and how we can have a shared horizon based on our struggle against inequality, our promotion of multilateralism and shared institutions. So I don't want to go on for too long. I just wanted to say that S&D firmly believe that we're probably going through the most complicated period in our history since the end of the Second World War, since 1945. It's internally very complicated because we've stopped competing against our traditional rivals, the Conservatives or the Christian Democrats. Now we are fighting against the populist right, the far right, and you are experiencing the same thing in Latin America. And internally, there are 200 MEPs out of 700. That's almost a quarter of the European Parliament. And out of the 7 or 8 most populated countries, we have 15 to 20% of the vote. But not only are we facing huge internal challenges, but at the same time, and this is obviously related, we are facing an international and geopolitical landscape that is incredibly turbulent, where those traditional alliances and allegiances can't be taken for granted. Currently, we're seeing huge power struggles, and trade agreements and relationships are not guaranteed. Violence is rife, and we've already been discussing this all this afternoon. So I wanted to discuss how we can be more coordinated in order to overcome these internal challenges, and also how to survive or how to envisage shared horizons. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to the panelists here, these wonderful guests that we have with us. First of all, I'd like to give the floor and welcome Maya Fernandez Allende, who's a biologist and vet from the University of Chile, but she has been a civil servant for many years. She was president of the Chamber of Deputies, vice president. She has a long political career and probably a very important academic career as well, which demonstrates her commitment to public policy. And she's also very focused on equality as well. I'd like to give her the floor.
Good afternoon and greetings to those joining us. It's an honor to take part in this discussion alongside colleagues from Latin America and the Caribbean and the EU. I thank the S&D for inviting me. Now, today we're brought together with the conviction that democratic principles and multilateralism are key to address the challenges of our time. Now, I know we don't have much time, so I'm just going to read out a few ideas, and I'll try to be brief. I come from a region which faces enormous challenges, and there's no time to address them. We're facing a historic crossroads which requires bold, transformative, and deeply humanistic approaches. In Latin America today, we're facing a multidimensional crisis which goes beyond economic dimensions. It relates to security and other citizen concerns. To give you some data, from 2024, the Eurobarometer gives us a complex landscape. Although support for democracy increased by 50%, which is the first increase in a decade, dissatisfaction with democracy has reached around 70% of the population. In Chile, the Public Study Center in March 2025 highlighted that only 44% of Chileans considered that democracy is preferable to any other form of government. 33.5% stated that they could live in a democracy or under an authoritarian regime. This is something which should be of great concern for us, particularly in a country like Chile, which experienced one of the worst dictatorships, which affected many families, including my own. So, there is a generalized sense that institutions are not able to effectively address the concerns of citizens. There's a crisis of representative democracy. We're facing major tensions, inequality, distrust, and polarization. This threatens the stability of our democracies, which enables the emergence of authoritarian regimes calling for the use of force, particularly when it comes to addressing insecurity and uncertainty. Overcoming the undermining of democracy will require sustained efforts. We mustn't just be concerned, we must take action. In order to achieve this, we must strengthen our narrative, but we must also take concrete steps to reform democratic institutions, ensure transparency, participation, inclusion, and civic education involving youth. And here I wish to recognize the initiative led by President Gabriel Boric alongside other presidents at the high-level meeting which took place in Santiago, which was called Democracy Always. This is something we're particularly proud of. One of the topics is strengthening multilateralism because it also strengthens democracy. In the previous panel, we stated that we live in a world in which we should advocate for multilateralism. The Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, has mentioned this several times. We live in an institution which was built by our forefathers to address the challenges of the 20th century. And today's world is very different. For example, today countries in Latin America and the Caribbean account for a large share of the world's population and economy, and we have growing economic weight, yet we remain underrepresented in multilateral institutions. This imbalance highlights the urgency of initiating a reform of multilateralism to make it more representative and to address current challenges, such as the climate change, which we've discussed previously, inequality, war, global pandemics, challenges related to digital technology and artificial intelligence. This data offers guidance, but political will is our duty. is it possible to come up with a different type of multilateralism which would be more democratic and more inclusive with real enforcement mechanisms? We need to be bold and to work together to build institutions for the 21st century which provide what our citizens need. We need to be bold to defend democracy and to offer concrete solutions to a loss of trust among citizens. We need to continue working together towards a sustainable, fair, solidarity-based and democratic transition. We need to speak to new generations, to youth who are living in uncertainty and who are looking for more resilient models based on respect for the environment. In Latin America and in Europe, we want peace and we have a democratic tradition. And we need to continue promoting these principles. This open dialogue is the beginning of a path ahead, and I particularly appreciate the contributions of the first panel. They were very relevant, and we discussed this. When we talk about resilience, when we talk about disaster management, we're talking about communities. And this is what we have to do. I come from a political background. I was an MP. And at some point in time, we seem to have lost sight of community-based work. And that's where we need to focus, because there is a political crisis, and it's something that needs to be addressed together through strategies and cooperation, but above all, by listening to citizens, to youth, and hearing their concerns. And I'll stop there because I know time is limited, but I'm ready to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Maya. Now I'd like to give the floor to Cecilia Nicolini, who's an old friend of this house and of the group. I'm sure many of you know her. She was the Secretary of the Environment, Minister of the Environment and Innovation of the government of Argentina, and today she is an MP of Mercosur. And we're in constant dialogue with her in the different spaces that we share. And she actually had to manage the negotiations for vaccines during the COVID pandemic, so she's very familiar with the international landscape. We have discussed lots of different issues with her. Thank you, Javi. I hope that we are friends, not just old friends, but friends as much as possible. And it's always great to be here. I hope we have a very rich discussion, because sometimes when there's a great deal of familiarity, especially during Mercosur, that leads to very interesting discussions. So I'm going to be very brief and mention a lot of the points that came up in the first panel. Javi and Maya already said this, but Argentina is going through a very complicated period. We talked about unilateralism and authoritarianism, which is embodied in what is going on in Argentina right now. We're used to hyperbole and doing things in a very exaggerated way, and the same is happening now with our president. But Javi already mentioned that we are actually going through one of the most complicated periods in our history since the Second World War. I would say actually it's even more complicated than it seems, because there is a climate crisis, which is a conflict that brings together the largest number of stakeholders in the world. In fact, all people and all the countries throughout the world are affected. And that puts us in a context that's unheard of. We need to think about how to address this complexity and find solutions that can be discussed, which is what we're trying to do here to a certain extent. We're finding different spaces where Latin America and Europe can develop their relationship. And another problem we face when trying to find solutions is that we have a software or a system, a capitalist system, which is like Windows 11 or Mac operating system 26, but it's operating on the same hardware, or like a Mac from 1984, and it's going to explode. If we don't change the way in which we produce and consume, but also the way in which we relate to one another, and those international financial relationships as well, which I think are the backbone of the problem here. And perhaps it can be part of the solution as well. Aloysius previously mentioned some potential solutions to overcome this complexity that we're facing, perhaps create a fund to respond to climate issues in the different countries. And the problem that we've been dealing with, and a major challenge for COP30 in Brazil, will be that it's not just about discussion and dialogue, it's about implementation now, about executing those solutions. Eva Martin talked about cooperation and implementation, but we need to think about how we work with the different countries. How do we turn words into reality? How do we really consolidate what we're doing? And there are a number of things to take into account. We need new ways of drawing up policy, new leadership, new rules that can transform multilateralism, which is not really responding to those new questions that are emerging, as Iratxe mentioned at the beginning of the event. So Maya talked about bravery and other qualities that are necessary when debating things like sovereignty and autonomy. And this is particularly relevant for Latin America and the Caribbean. So against this backdrop, in a region that's highly fragmented, where we're not capable of getting to the COP on the same page, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean, when we had to negotiate, we weren't able to reach an agreement. We couldn't understand why it was only possible for us to reach an agreement with Brazil and Uruguay, and we were unable to find common ground with other countries in the region. Brazil, or this a region with the Amazon with a high amount of biodiversity. So we need to find common ground, topics that we agree on, in order to move forward. How can we turn this system around? Okay, I've only got 1 minute left, so I'm going to have to start to wrap up. So how can we turn things around? What are the proposals? What are the discussions that we need to have in order to really transform things? First of all, and I said this sort of jokingly, but I was sort of serious as well. In Brazil, if we think about transparency, the bank's transparency, financing, funding, the different programs, why don't we have similar systems in other international banks or in the IMF, for example? And Javi, I'm not going to discuss what's going on in Argentina specifically, but perhaps that's the root cause of the structural inequality that we're experiencing in countries like Argentina. And there were lots of other topics that I wanted to address, but I'm just going to focus on a couple here. When we think about how we can work on this agenda in Latin America, in the context of a climate crisis and that transformation, there's actually a recent study that will be released shortly, and it says that those who are funding that crisis that we're experiencing are developing countries. If we measure the budget that goes towards this, it's 5 to 10% of their annual budget. In Brazil, there was flooding. Argentina experienced the same thing. And so we need to have a discussion about how to transform this funding model and how to help with development and implementation in those countries. And I'm going to stop here because I know there are other topics that need to be addressed.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. We also have Luis Blandón with us, who is from Nicaragua, and he's part of the opposition party UNAMOS. He has actively promoted protests for democracy and justice in Nicaragua. He's currently in Spain, and he's internationally advocating for justice in his country. So hopefully he'll be able to share his Central American perspective on these issues. Thank you very much, Javi, and thank you to the S&D for inviting me. From the outset, I would say that what was approved on the 8th of October in terms of the strategy for Latin America and the EU is very encouraging, not just for Nicaragua, but in terms of addressing the context we're currently living in. Now, I come from a Central American region which is rather turbulent, and we haven't been spared from what's going on in the world. I come from a country which currently has a dictatorship in place, which forced me to leave my country and to flee to a safer harbour. But it's not about that. It's about looking for solutions. We can see, for example, what's happening in El Salvador, with a president that all of the countries in the region would like to have, because he's actually managed to address insecurity in the country, but at what cost? Violating human rights, etc. So there really are setbacks happening in Costa Rica, for example, which was on the right track for some time, now is moving towards populism, which will dismantle everything that's been built over the past years. So I'd like to perhaps take stock of the challenges we face as progressives and how we can address these challenges together, cooperating. First of all, we need to strengthen democracy and human rights. This is something which has always characterized the S&D and the left. And recently, the far right and right-wing governments have manipulated this and portrayed themselves as defenders of human rights. And this has happened. We're seeing this, and in order to address this, we have to take the reins of democratic movements in our countries to ensure political change. For example, in Spain, the Prime Minister Sanchez has been very supportive in terms of what we're doing in Nicaragua, but he's also showed how important it is to cooperate internationally to improve our societies. Secondly, we must strengthen multilateral institutions, and this will require offering support to institutions such as the UN, but also in financial institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF. They need to be more representative and more effective when it comes to promoting sustainable development. Third, we need to look at international cooperation through agreements that can help us to ratify legislation on matters such as climate change and other areas. We also need to foster South-South cooperation among developing countries so that we can share experience, but also strengthen areas such as education and health, among others. So there are a number of challenges we have to address, and this will require political cooperation. how can we reinvent ourselves in this context? We have to go beyond the narrative. You mentioned coming closer to citizens, to communities. We need to regain their trust and popular support to ensure that these policies are truly supported. Thank you very much, and I'll leave it at that for now.
Muchísimas gracias, Luis.
Thank you very much, Luis. And finally, and last but not least, obviously, we have Beatriz Paredes, who's a sociologist and a politician. She's also been a diplomat from Mexico. She has a long political career as an ambassador in Brazil, in Cuba. She was also the president of the chamber, the lower house in Mexico. And she was also the president of the Social Democratic Party between 2007 and 2010. So I'm going to give you the floor because I think you'll be able to give us a very important perspective as one of our strategic partners in Mexico. And it's also a bridge between North America and South America. It's also it's a bridge between Europe and Latin America. So you probably experience a lot of challenges in a very acute way, because when there's tension and conflict, the first thing that goes down are the bridges. Thank you, Javi. It's a real honor to be here today. Thank you very much for the invitation, Leda. Thank you, Hannah. And I'm very pleased to be part of this fantastic panel. I prepared a text, but I'm going to put it to one side. I'm not going to read it because I want to take advantage of the time that I have here. And I wanted to focus on some key issues before I answer your specific question. I think that the EU is the embodiment of democracy in the 20th century in its most evolved form. I'm totally convinced of that, which is why I believe that an agreement between progressives would help us to defend the unity of the EU. Any attempts at separatism in the EU is reactionary and disruptive to the democratic development of Western society. And this is incomprehensible, and the war against Ukraine is also inadmissible. And Mr. Aloisio talked about the spending on defense. It makes no sense that the military strategy led by Trump has led to EU countries rechanneling funds into defense. And I think we need to have a wide debate on how to respond strategically to this in order to ensure peace and stability in the different regions around the world without responding to Trump's provocations. You've asked about how we live, and I would say that in Latin America, and specifically in Mexico, tension caused by how Western leadership is being reconsidered. This is something I really wanted to highlight. It was unthinkable at the beginning of the 21st century that leadership of the Western world in North America would actually rebel against the Western world. So it completely goes against history, but this is a leap which actually is based on logic. What we can't do is simplify that logic or that reasoning. because the idea is to reposition those who have a simplistic and closed view of development at the top of the food chain, which is why at this particular point in time, agreements that are focused on more openness and multilateralism are signed and ratified. We hope that the agreement between the EU and Mexico has been corrected and all those flaws have been corrected so that Mexico can sign it. We really want to sign it, and it's as important as the Mercosur agreement for us. Europe and Latin America together can expect democracy, can expect to be at the forefront of the Western world. And what is being called into question now, colleagues, is the prevalence, the predominance of the Western world. The new millennium in the 21st century needs to focus on having a society that is more equal and that isn't ruled by the elite. And that means that we need to have another kind of discussion. The world of technology that can only be accessed by people with wealth who have computers and mobile phones. This needs to be generalized. Global Gateway needs to increase internet coverage in all countries throughout Latin America so that technology isn't reserved for the rich. We need to establish an EU Latin America Erasmus, given that a lot of grants and postgraduate programs have been closed down in the US. Should we not consider some of the key questions to try and understand why people are dissatisfied with our democracies? The economic model obviously has not satisfied everyone's needs. It's not the problem with democracy, it's the economic model that's in place. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Beatriz. Now we'll make the most of the last half hour, and in line with our program, we'll open up a round of questions. If anyone from the audience wishes to put them to our panelists who are here with us today. So, if anyone has any questions, we'll make the most of having Leire, who initiated this event. I'll give her the floor. Well, my question is in line with what you discussed in this panel and the previous one regarding dissatisfaction with democracy and the technological context. I believe this is particularly important because currently at the EU, we're discussing tools against disinformation, because that's one of the aspects which is threatening our democracies. So, how can we ensure that we have tools to secure that within the current context? Some tools are being imposed on us and are in line with the political agenda. So, from a progressive perspective and within Latin America, which tools, which mechanisms can we put on the table in order to confront this imposed technological model, which in some cases is threatening our democracies?
El micro.
Microphone, please. I'll just take this opportunity to say that there are 200 people watching us online and via internet, so please turn on your microphone so they can hear us. Now, I just have a question and an observation. We're talking about how we can build a progressive agenda for multilateralism, democracy, and sustainable development. So, as progressives, how do we coordinate this agenda when worldwide and in Latin America there's a dispersion of progressive approaches and the left wing in general? So how do we build that unity that we so desperately need when there are so many political differences and different conceptions of democracy? Next, we discussed dissatisfaction in politics, and I think there is a crisis of political systems at stake. They have lost legitimacy in many cases, and they don't seem to be addressing the needs of people. So, as progressives, as the left, how can we change the perception of people regarding politicians? I believe there are a number of factors that need to be addressed here. You mentioned the imposed digital models, disinformation. How do we change our approach to ensure that we have a common, unified agenda? Thank you. There are two questions there at the back. Yes, good afternoon. Thank you very much. Marita Gonzalez, the Argentinian Syndicate of Workers. I have a question which is in line with the previous speaker regarding the democratic deficit and how progressive governments and parties can address differences, particularly when it comes to free trade agreements. For example, the Mercosur agreement, which is very well known, but it's not the only one. And there's also the Mexico Free Trade Agreement and Mercosur EFTA. And what was the issue there was a lack of transparency and perhaps a lack of involvement of civil society. So could progressive policies bring something to the table here? There was a sense of lack of accountability, a lack of participation of workers, trade unions, and civil society. In some cases, it has been done, but only on a fragmented basis, for example, involving some representatives in Brazil, but not across Mercosur. For example, there is a regional tripartite system in place in Mercosur. So perhaps these are just some ideas to improve participation. I'll also ask a question. If you could introduce yourself, that would be great. My name is Alejandre. I'm here with colleagues from the Mercosur Trade Union Confederation. And I'm from Brazil, from the Workers' Union. And I'd like to ask a question. I believe there's a contradiction in defending an agreement with Mercosur, which would benefit economic sectors in our region who, in some cases, have financed attempts of coup d'etat against our governments. So, for example, the 8th of January, against Lula and his government. And these are sectors which may benefit from free trade with Europe, such as agribusiness, mining, exporters, livestock farmers, and the trade unions are highlighting that these sectors have the highest level of forced labor, child labor, the highest proportion of agricultural conflict. And we see this as a contradiction. As progressives within Mercosur, it's difficult to defend an agreement which may actually exacerbate inequalities. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to make it very clear that trade unions are against the agreements and have been for several years, and our position won't change. Thank you. I don't know if there are any further questions. Perhaps I'll take the opportunity to ask one myself. We have one at the back of the room. Please, go ahead, and then we'll stop. Can you hear me? Yes, very well, thank you. Teresa Payares from Youth Proactive, and I'm a researcher at Comillas in Madrid. First of all, thank you to all of you for organizing this event. I would like to react to what Madam Paredes said, as well as what was said about misinformation, youth education, multilateralism. Ms. Paredes mentioned a unified program. We have the Erasmus program here in Europe, which many of us have benefited from, and perhaps this is relevant within the multilateralism framework post-2030. You also mentioned disinformation. There are an increasing number of young people who are dissatisfied with the current state of politics, and we know that more and more young men are voting for the far right. So this is something that should concern all of us. So I think about it on a daily basis. How can we address this from governments and through multilateralism? How can we address these disenchanted youth? I believe our colleague from Argentina mentioned this. We need to involve more youth in the COP meetings, for example. So how can the left in Latin America and the European Union address this? How can we involve young people more in these spaces? They feel that they're left out. How can we make sure that they are indeed involved? Thank you very much. Well, first, I'd like to just say a few words about the agreement. Your words are very welcome, and that's the reason why we have these types of dialogues. In terms of the negotiation process and the beneficiaries of these agreements, in terms of the negotiations, of course, they could be improved, that's for sure. Now, the negotiators are democratically elected representatives who have a mandate, and in the case of Mercosur, these are negotiators who have been elected in each of the countries of the Mercosur bloc, and they are in charge of negotiating in the interest of those that they represent. They have to represent national interests. And in this particular case, the negotiation has been going on for 20 years in order to find an outcome and a compromise. Now, of course, it won't always please everyone, but it's about finding some sort of common ground. In terms of trade between Mercosur and the EU, trade already exists between Mercosur and the EU. That's a fact. And it's a significant level of trade. Many people have benefited from it. What the trade agreement will bring about is establishing standards for that trade and facilitating that trade. In the case of the EU, we pay particular attention to high standards. And I personally think that these standards, which come with these trade agreements, will strengthen sustainability of our trade with Mercosur. They will also bring about better standards for trade within Mercosur. And it will, of course, be beneficial for the governments of Mercosur and citizens. Trade agreements do not generate trade, they set standards for trade. So we want to see trade bringing about benefits in terms of growth, but it's up to governments to ensure that those benefits are distributed. That's up to national governments. And that basically has to be achieved through tax. And I would also say that for us, in particular, this is a free trade agreement. If it did not have these characteristics, it would never have been approved by the European Parliament. It's about building a strategic partnership between the EU and Mercosur at a time of unilateralism and protectionism, which go against our common standards and rules and institutions. And it will serve to regulate and set standards for trade. That being said, I'm sure there are other opinions within our group on this matter, but I just wanted to make that clear. And I'd like to just make the most of this opportunity to ask a question to each of your representatives. We have a very representative group here. Perhaps Maya could tell us about the situation in Chile and the political situation. We know that the president has been an inspiration for progressives around the world, a relatively small country, but with great potential and a source of inspiration. So I'd like to hear more about that. Then from Cecilia, perhaps you could tell us about building an alternative, which is being done currently by the opposition in Argentina. We have great hopes for this, and we'd like to cooperate more closely in the face of Milei's government. We'd also like to hear about Nicaragua's future prospects and your views on the situation relating to the dictatorship. And we'd also like to hear from Beatriz about the situation in Mexico. The president has a very consolidated leadership on the international stage as well. And she's been able to have an effective and coordinated approach to establishing a new leadership in a very short space of time. So we have the utmost respect for her, and we'd like to hear your views on this. So I'd like to make the most of you being here to hear your views on your countries. And if you'd agree, perhaps we can go around in the opposite direction to how we proceeded earlier. So please, go ahead, Beatriz.
2 minutos.
We only have a couple of minutes, 3 minutes each. First of all, I propose that we hold a meeting not just for politicians but also for academics and social leaders in order to discuss a lot of the questions that have come up here, because these are key questions. With regard to Leide's question, Leide, I think one of the problems that we face as progressive Democrats is that we're trapped in a paradox. We're unable to build democratic societies of critical and conscious citizens. And modernity has led us to develop and build consumer societies who are informed by this technological revolution, and they consume candidates as if they were an electoral product that satisfies their appetite or not, depending on the packaging that they come in. So we need to get rid of ideologies and in with slogans. So in this context, this hate speech, this provocative discourse is fertile ground for manipulation. And so we're being left outside of this new dynamic of communication. Especially in Spanish, we're seeing how we're being left out of the communication when it comes to new technologies, and only those leaderships with huge social presence have not been trapped by this consumerist dynamic. So when it comes to Mexico, the Mexican president has made a huge effort. She's been very dignified and tried to find an alternative when it comes to negotiating, because we are experiencing a very complicated situation with the US. It's always been a very complicated relationship, but it's become even more so recently. And I think she's been able to find a way through in these negotiations. The polls suggest that she's very popular. She has a majority in Congress. And the legislative power is experiencing deterioration. I think representative democracy is facing a crisis. Congress is being weakened, and parties are not functioning properly. And we need to think about other types of democracy, and this is happening everywhere. In the case of Mexico, people need to be able to express themselves and be engaged in politics. And I would say that the most pressing issue that we face is organized crime in certain regions, which is taking up space that it shouldn't do. We need to discuss in Latin America the role of organized crime and drug trafficking and how security has become a key issue in our agenda. Thank you very much, Beatriz. I'm now going to give the floor to Luis and then Cecilia. Thank you. In the case of Nicaragua, I think we've had Daniel Ortega in power for 18 years. He was elected legitimately through elections, and then he dismantled all the powers of the state. He modified the constitution and created powers that didn't exist, like a co-presidency. So he co-presides with his wife, and his family are ministers in this government. So the Nicaraguan opposition is also quite diverse. We understand that the dictatorship is in direct opposition with democracy. We want to be able to express our rights, and we need institutions that respond to citizens' needs. It's quite difficult to be involved in politics when you're in exile. And part of the members of UNAMO actually have to use pseudonyms in order to communicate with one another. They need to access the internet through different countries. I won't go into detail for security reasons, but this is we're fighting against a system that criminalizes us or would happily put us in prison. So it's a very complicated landscape, and I'm not going to talk about our strategies, the strategies we're implementing right now, but we do have some opportunities. We believe that there is a chance that the president's supporters are in a weaker position, and so in the future we hope that a transition will take place. The situation is quite difficult as an organization with the biggest progressive group that exists in the country. And it's complicated because last year when we had our National Congress in secret, there was a security breach and 38 people were imprisoned from my organization. There is a list of political prisoners that's over 140 names long, and so any kind of political action is neutralized when the dictatorship realizes what we're doing. As I said previously, I still am optimistic, and I want to take this opportunity that we have to erode the political system that's in place. We still are very much focused on achieving that transition in Nicaragua. Thank you. Now, Cecilia. I'll be very brief with regard to Mercosur. You mentioned Argentina within this context, and we've been saying for some time now that this is a historic opportunity for Latin America and the Caribbean. Perhaps it's the last major opportunity we have to develop in this sense. But there's one key thing that's missing, which is a coordinated regional strategy. We need to strengthen our institutions, and I'm half joking, half serious. When people ask me what Parlasur is, I say it's like the European Parliament, but without any money and without any power, or much less power and much less glamorous than the European Parliament. But these spaces are really important. They have to be strengthened. And so despite the complexity, and I agree what the colleagues already said, there are many challenges that we're facing. We've discussed them at length. And in Argentina, there's a lot of dissent. We don't agree on everything. We don't agree on everything in Mercosur. We've discussed it at length with Javi and Leire, but when faced with the far-right policies and unilateralism, I think faced with this complicated situation, there's an opportunity to bring our countries together through different projects, political projects that are ethical and that include different conditions and variables, and they will allow us to develop our own system in Latin America. And we have the energy transition, the digital transition, which are major challenges. And perhaps we cannot just be providers in a neo-colonial sense. We can perhaps be more proactive. But for that, we need to be able to agree on certain things. We need to develop our own financial instruments and shared common funds, environmental standards. And the EU-Mercosur agreement will perhaps allow us to protect ourselves against the climate crisis, and so that will obviously be beneficial for our region. So we do agree on the fact that this agreement is positive, and it will be reviewed every 3 years, because that will allow us to adapt to the major changes that we're experiencing right now. And I've only got 30 seconds left to describe the political situation in Argentina. But we have elections coming up in 10 days. People are still quite confused because they don't know whether to vote for Trump, to Vicente, to Milei, or who they're voting for on the voting paper, because the candidates that we have right now in Argentina, well, this situation is unheard of. In Argentina, we've already had interference from the states in the past, and now we're experiencing something similar. And in Forza Patria, which is what we're discussing here, what we say and what we've said for a number of years now with allies and the other countries within Mercosur and multilateral banks and investment institutions, is that there is a type of Argentina, even though social media, fake news, the media talks, despite what they say about Argentina, there's still a country that believes in human rights. We're a country that has always fought for human rights. We are feminist as well. We have fought for abortion rights for women in the country, and it's not a case of us being over the top or going too far. The situation that we're experiencing is not our fault. In fact, quite the opposite. We're a country that defends the environment, nature. We fight against climate change, and we defend public education, public hospitals, and we welcome migrants from neighboring countries. We're a country that also defends gender equality and equality for all those who live in the country. We defend the dignity of workers and national industry, and above all, we believe that if we want a developed, autonomous, free and sovereign country, social justice has to be one of our key values. And so that's what we want, and that is what we will vote for. This sounds like a rallying speech, but in the next few years, we will focus on that. You saw in the previous election the victory of Kicillof, and so we are working on that for the next couple of years, and hopefully I should be able to give you good news.
Pues muchas gracias.
Well, thank you very much, Cecilia. And now, Maya. Well, whenever we talk about democracy, I believe that we should have a whole day discussing this, really. Throughout history, and this is something that I've said on many occasions. I'm not currently in government, but we should learn to listen to one another and hear our differences. And in Chile, we had to come up with a new path for democracy. This is how we were able to recover democracy. That's why historical memory is so important. And that's why I gave you some figures regarding support for democracy. They should be concerning, because we can't simply put a percentage on democracy. We have to actively defend it. That's very important. And just like our colleague from Uruguay said, we need to have a common vision. We need to go beyond our differences, which are legitimate, because in democracy there will be differences. That is the foundation of democratic values. But we need to come up with strategic unity, and we need to be bold. We live in a multipolarized world. We need to strengthen democracy. We need to strengthen multilateralism. We need to ensure that we have representation. That is a major challenge for us. And we can't simply continue discussing this. We have to move to action. And that's why it was so interesting to hear from the first panelists from the Brazilian Development Bank and the UNDP. We heard tangible measures of how we can actually achieve this. Because sometimes when we speak to our citizens, we need to be able to justify what we're doing. Sometimes we have good measures in place, but they're not binding. So we also need to look at how these measures will be enforced. That applies to a number of different initiatives when it comes to gender equality as well. And then there's the matter of security. If you ask citizens what they're most concerned about, in many countries in Latin America, as Beatrice said, it's insecurity. So there's also a challenge there. Can progressive forces ensure security? This hasn't always been the case. In the past, the right wing have claimed that we don't have an agenda for security, and that's not true anymore. Gabriel Boric has mentioned this. We can defend democracy whilst also ensuring security for our citizens, and that's a major challenge. We can also fight disinformation. Today, everyone reads headlines. So we need to look at how we can win back our youth. We need to speak their language. That's particularly relevant. And we also have to address the digital divide. Women are particularly affected by this. We need to look at artificial intelligence. Are we going to see it as an enemy or as a way of addressing our challenges? Of course, it needs to be regulated. But perhaps it's a tool that we should learn to use effectively. So, once again, we need to be bold, we need to address common challenges, and we need to have an agenda that people can truly come on board with. Now, Chile has made a great deal of progress. I was actually a member of this government for several years, and that's why I mentioned the meeting organized by Gabriel Boric, among others, to defend multilateralism. But there are challenges, and I say this as a citizen. We have Yasmin Tenahara, who is the Minister for Work, who's a candidate, and I'm very supportive of her. Of course, we have challenges, differences, but we do need to think about what's good for Chile at the end of the day. Thank you.
Bueno, pues con este final tan
Now, on those inspiring words and encouraging words, perhaps we can move to the closing remarks. And I'd like to thank all of those who've taken part in this Latin American Days. And I thank also the coordinator for Eurolat. Congratulations for today.
Después de todo lo que hemos escuchado, poco más.
So after everything that's been said, there's not much more I can add, but I'm going to be very brief because when we work together as part of a network, when there are so many people involved, we also can enjoy the generosity of those who are going to, we should be mindful of the people who are going to use the room afterwards. So I wanted to draw a few conclusions from what we've discussed today, and I think they set the course for what we're going to move on to next. I think it's been left very clear that this is not just about common values and a historic relationship. There's a commitment and interest in working together on a specific shared agenda, and that shared agenda involves a few more dates in the next few months that we need to really get as much out of as possible. We have the CELAC summit. We need to move from words into action and create a transformative shared agenda that we can follow up on and that is measurable, with measurable outcomes. We've talked about the need for this agenda to address the fight against equality and building resilient societies, because today in both regions, as you well know, The challenges that we're facing and the crises that are emerging require mechanisms that will develop the ability to respond for our citizens. We also need to include the most vulnerable sectors of society, identify exactly where they are and what instruments and guarantees they need, and what social network they need in order to be covered. We've talked about different instruments like the Solidarity Fund to respond to climate emergencies, and then we have a shared agenda because the region has been discussing how to establish common mechanisms in order to respond to climate emergencies. And the EU is actually currently debating how to improve its civil protection mechanisms and how to be more resilient when there are climate crises and fires and increased temperatures. And so exchanging views, having a shared agenda to build resilient societies are the main objectives that we've discussed today. We also want to work together in our financial institutions. We want to cancel the debt and focus on horizontal financial systems that will allow Latin America and the Caribbean to address and achieve their financial goals. Together, we hope to achieve additional funding for development. We need to go further than the official funding available. We need to mobilize resources, and the banks of the private sector, of the government, of international organizations have to work together towards a common goal. We've talked about the need for this agenda to take into account the different communities and geographical regions, because agendas that are built from the top down generally don't work. We need to take into account rural communities, indigenous communities, which often aren't taken into account in public policies which are designed in the capital. So that's crucial for a progressive and specific agenda. We've talked about the need to reform the multilateral approach. We need to confront the multilateral approach that some people want to impose. There are alternatives, and now is the time to come together and unite in the multilateral setting. We also have the elections of the General Secretary of the UN, where Latin America and the Caribbean have a golden opportunity. From the EU, we will be offering our support and hoping or driving you towards that opportunity and boosting the role of women as well. A progressive agenda should also focus on peace and multilateralism as key elements in a world that doesn't want to renounce on the well-being of different citizens. We understand that we're facing global challenges, and we all have the responsibility to find different solutions and alternatives. We've also identified the shared goals that we have, and that's why the goal of this event is not to end here, but we will establish a new shared roadmap, and we will see each other first in Belém and then in Santa Marta, or the other way around. And in the next few months, we have a number of other engagements in which joint action, shared action, will become stronger. We said this morning that we need a world that focuses on the rule of law and that won't leave anyone behind, especially those who are most vulnerable and powerless. We cannot let those who are strongest rule over us. And so, having identified those goals in a very specific agenda and having this roadmap that will be established here today, I'd like to thank the over 325 people who have been following us this afternoon. That figure has not dropped all afternoon, and a lot of them come from the region. This shows the interest there is in this kind of discussion. I'd like to thank those who work for Parliament and those who have served us coffee, tea, etc. I'd like to thank those who have worked behind the scenes for months now. working tirelessly so that this event could actually take place, starting with Isabel, Alexandra, Francois, Ilona, and Luca, who started this, Eva, Anika, and for all of those people, I don't want to forget anyone because they have done an amazing job. I'd like to thank my friend Hannah, who is always there to help with whatever's needed, Javi Lopez, and of course to the colleagues from the region from being here. Thank you to all the panelists who came here to have their voices heard, to convey important messages. Today has been a great day, but it doesn't end here. Tomorrow we will continue with the debates that are organized by VIPS. We continue to be hopeful and hope for a progressive world that we've always been very committed to, and together we hope that this will become a reality. Thank you.